The rain hadn't stopped for hours when Daniel Carter stood on his neighbor's porch, holding nothing but a borrowed screwdriver. He almost turned back. The porch light was off, the curtains drawn, and the whole house looked like it was pretending to be empty. But he'd told himself he'd return it tonight. And he was the kind of man who kept small promises too. He knocked once. Then again. The door creaked open just an inch. The chain was still on. One eye appeared in the gap, pale, startled, then something else. Something that wasn't quite relief, but was close. Her voice dropped to a whisper, trembling just enough to tighten his chest. "You picked the perfect night," she said. Before he could ask what that meant, a loud crash echoed from somewhere inside the house. Not an accident. Not something falling. The kind of crash that sounds like a decision. And in that moment, Daniel Carter understood that returning a simple tool was going to cost him something he hadn't planned to spend. Daniel was 38 years old and had been fixing things his entire life. Appliances, pipes, fences, engines. If something broke, he figured out how to make it whole again. It was not a glamorous skill. It did not make him wealthy, but it made him useful. Which was the thing he valued most about himself, now that there was a little girl depending on him to stay upright. Emma was 8. She had her mother's eyes gray-green, the kind of color that changed with the light, and her mother's habit of going quiet when she was thinking hard. She'd had those eyes for 8 years, and for the last 3 of them, it had just been the 2 of them in the house on Birchwood Lane. Renee had been gone since Emma was 5. An aneurysm, swift and total, the kind of thing nobody gets any warning about. They'd been eating dinner, the 3 of them, and Renee had put down her fork with the careful deliberateness of someone who had suddenly forgotten what forks were for. That was the only warning there was, and it lasted less than 2 seconds. Daniel had called for an ambulance. He had kept Emma calm. He had held Renee's hand while they waited. He had done all the things that needed doing, and none of them had been enough. He'd spent the first year afterward in a fog so thick he sometimes forgot to eat. He did the necessary things, fed Emma, bathed her, took her to school, answered the teacher's notes, got her to pediatrician appointments, but he did them on a kind of autopilot that he wasn't sure was healthy and didn't have the bandwidth to examine. The house got messier than it would have. The mail piled up. He stopped returning calls from people who weren't her teachers or her doctor. Then one evening Emma had climbed into his lap, all 5 years of her, and pressed her cheek against his chest. She said, in her quiet and serious voice, "I'm still here, Daddy." She wasn't trying to comfort him, she was stating a fact she'd decided he needed to hear. And something in that factual tenderness had reached him where nothing else had. He'd held her for a long time. He'd made dinner afterward. He'd called his brother back that night for the first time in 3 months. That had been the end of the fog. He did small jobs now. Independent contractor work, homes, businesses, the occasional emergency call in the middle of the night when a pipe had let go or a circuit panel was sparking. He kept his rates fair and his schedule flexible so he could walk Emma to school every morning and be home before the bus dropped her off in the afternoon. He drove a truck that was 9 years old and still running because he maintained it himself. He made coffee in a dented percolator that had belonged to his father. He cooked reasonable dinners 4 nights a week and ordered pizza the other 3 and didn't feel guilty about the pizza. He had a small circle of people he trusted. His brother, Marcus, who lived in Pittsburgh and came down twice a year and never stayed less than a full week. A woman named Greta, who was 70, and Emma's unofficial grandmother by mutual agreement, who lived 2 streets over and could be called upon in emergencies. A handful of clients who'd become something close to friends over years of showing up when things went wrong. He didn't ask for much. He didn't need to. The house on Birchwood Lane was modest but solid. A craftsman bungalow with wide eaves and a porch that needed repainting. He kept meaning to get to it before the winter, and winter had come and gone twice while he kept meaning, and a backyard that was just large enough for Emma to have claimed 3 separate territories in: the reading corner by the fence, the climbing area near the shed, the flat strip of grass she'd designated as a sports region after a brief and intense interest in soccer that had since evolved into a brief and intense interest in badminton. His neighbor's house, a pale blue Cape Cod with white trim, sat close on the left side. Close enough that he could hear her wind chimes when the breeze came off the hill. He didn't know her well. Claire Weston had moved in 14 months ago, sometime in November. He remembered the moving truck because it had come on a Tuesday and had been finished by mid-afternoon, which was fast. Either she hadn't brought much or she'd hired efficient people. She was quiet in the way people are quiet when they've decided to be, not in the way of shyness. She kept her curtains mostly drawn. She accepted deliveries herself rather than letting them leave packages on the porch. She was polite, genuinely so, not the performative kind, and had once brought him a jar of preserves from the farmer's market because he'd helped her drag a dead tree limb out of her yard after a storm. The preserves had been peach. They'd been very good. He'd thought about it a little, the curtains, the way she watched the street before stepping off her porch, the fact that she'd never once had a visitor that he'd noticed. He'd thought about it the way you think about a puzzle you don't have all the pieces to. He'd respected what seemed to be her preference for privacy and left it at that. He'd lent her the screwdriver 3 weeks ago when she'd been hanging something heavy on her wall and asked over the fence if he had a proper Phillips head. He'd handed it over without thinking twice and then forgotten about it entirely. Tonight, with Emma asleep upstairs and the rain hammering the roof in slow, uneven waves, he'd gone out to his toolbox in the garage for a rivet gun he needed for a job in the morning and noticed the gap in the driver's set. He almost left it. The weather was ugly, the kind of rain that falls sideways when the wind changes direction, that finds every gap in your collar, and it was past 9 o'clock, but the walk was 15 feet, and he liked having his tools accounted for. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing he was made of. He'd grabbed his jacket. He hadn't grabbed an umbrella. Now he stood on Claire Weston's porch in the dark, holding a wet screwdriver, listening to the rain and the echo of something that had broken inside the house. Something that had no innocent explanation and understanding, in the clean and immediate way that certain moments demand understanding, that the small thing had just become something else entirely. The chain slid free. The door opened, but not all the way, only enough for him to see her. Claire was wearing a gray sweater that she'd pulled around herself like armor. Her dark hair was loose and slightly damp, though it hadn't been raining long enough for that, which meant she'd been wet before the storm started, or she'd been somewhere she hadn't planned on being. Her face was composed in the deliberate way of someone working hard at composure. She was 35. He thought he'd never asked, and she'd never looked like this before. Even now, with her jaw set and her eyes carrying something close to controlled panic, she was the kind of woman whose stillness made you want to watch her carefully. Daniel was not a man given to noticing such things anymore. He noticed anyway. Daniel. She said his name like she was confirming it. Like she needed to be sure he was real. Brought your screwdriver back. He held it up. Felt immediately foolish. I know it's late. She glanced past him. Out at the rain-dark street. 1 second. 2. Then she stepped back and held the door open. Come inside. I don't have to. Please. The word was quiet, but had weight. Come inside. He stepped in. She shut the door behind him and threw the deadbolt in one practiced motion. The way people do when they've been thinking about that deadbolt all evening. The entryway was dim. A lamp on the side table cast a low, warm light, but the living room beyond it was dark, and the kitchen at the end of the hall was darker still. She hadn't turned lights on, he realized. She'd been sitting in the dark. Claire, he kept his voice low, though he wasn't sure why yet. What's going on? She had her arms crossed now, hands gripping her own elbows. She was looking at the floor between them. It's probably nothing, she said. That crash wasn't nothing. She closed her eyes briefly. No. A pause. No, it wasn't. She moved to the living room window, not to the center, but to the edge of the curtain, where she could look out at an angle without being visible from the street. He watched her stand there, the faint glow of a passing car moving across her face and then gone. He shouldn't be here tonight, she said softly. It wasn't meant for him. It was the kind of thing you say when you're recalculating, when the numbers aren't adding up the way they were supposed to. Who? Daniel said. She turned from the window. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the decision happening in her expression, the weighing of it. The cost of saying it out loud. Before she could answer, the lamp on the side table flickered. Once. Twice. Then the power went out entirely. And the house fell into the kind of darkness that has texture. Somewhere in the back of the house, slow and deliberate, a door handle turned. Daniel stood very still. He was not a man who panicked. That had been true before Renee, and even more true after, because panic was a luxury you couldn't afford when you were the only adult in a house with a child. What he did instead was observe, take inventory, decide. He could see almost nothing. The rain outside provided a low gray light through the gaps in the curtains, enough to make out shapes. Claire had gone rigid. She wasn't breathing audibly. The handle stopped. Silence except the rain. Then nothing, for 15 seconds that felt much longer. Daniel let his breath out slowly. He looked around the room with what little light there was. He'd been in here once before, briefly, when he'd helped her with the tree limb and she'd offered him water. He remembered the layout. Living room opening left to a hallway. Kitchen at the end. Back door off the kitchen. He remembered the back door. He moved to Claire and put his hand on her arm. Felt her flinch, then steady. "Back door," he said. Barely a sound. She nodded. He moved through the dark living room carefully, hands out, letting his feet find the floor. He'd always been good at navigating darkness. Emma had gone through a phase of being afraid of the dark, and he'd spent months learning to check on her in the night without turning any lights on, without waking her. The kitchen. He stopped. The back door was closed. The deadbolt above the handle was thrown, but the chain lock, a simple brass thing, hung loose, unhooked. He wasn't sure if that meant the door had been tried and the deadbolt had held, or if the chain had been that way all along. He reached up and hooked it. Claire had followed him in. She was a shadow in the kitchen doorway. He moved through the room, keeping low under the window line, and checked the side window above the counter. Locked. He tried to see into the backyard, but the rain and the dark turned the glass into a black mirror. He went back to her. "You need to tell me what's happening," he said quietly, not a request. She pressed her back against the kitchen doorframe and slid down until she was sitting, arms on her knees, the posture of someone who'd been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had just run out of space to keep carrying it. "His name is Warren Price," she said. She didn't tell him everything. He could tell she was editing as she went, giving him what she thought he needed, withholding what she'd decided was hers to carry alone. He let her do it. "You didn't push people when they were already this close to the edge." Warren Price, she said, had been her supervisor 4 years ago at a financial services firm in Philadelphia called Meridian Capital Advisors. She'd been a compliance analyst. It was not glamorous work. It was exactly what it sounded like. Someone whose job was to make sure the firm's operations didn't violate any of the 1,400 regulations that governed what they could and couldn't do with other people's money. She'd been good at it. She'd had a clear eye for irregularities. Price had been her direct supervisor. He was senior vice president of something she'd never been entirely sure. The title corresponded to an actual function, and he had the kind of confidence that comes from having never been seriously challenged. He ran his division like a principality. People deferred to him. People who didn't defer didn't stay long. She'd found the first discrepancy in a quarterly reconciliation in March. She'd almost passed it on to Price himself. He was her supervisor. That was protocol, but something had made her pause. Some instinct she still couldn't fully articulate, only that the number had been slightly wrong in a direction that benefited a specific account, and that account had a name she recognized from the company directory, and the name was his. She'd kept a copy of the reconciliation. She told herself it was standard practice, that compliance analysts kept records. She told herself this, and almost believed it. Then she found the second discrepancy. Then the third. By the time she found the fifth, she was not keeping copies out of professional habit. She was keeping them because she was frightened, and the copies were the only leverage she could imagine having. She'd left the firm in June. She told people it was a better opportunity elsewhere, which was the standard vocabulary of departure, and she'd accepted a position in Richmond that was a slight step down in title, but felt like oxygen after months of not quite being able to breathe. Price had found her in Richmond within the year. She didn't know how she had a theory involving a mutual contact at the firm who probably didn't know they were being used as a conduit, but she was never certain. He'd come to the parking structure of her office building one evening when she was leaving late. He'd walked beside her, unhurried, to her car. He'd never raised his voice. He'd said, she had something of his, and he'd like it returned, and if she was sensible, they would never need to speak again. She'd gone home and begun packing that night. I've been alone in this situation for 4 years, she said. I've moved twice. I've changed my number 3 times. I've been very careful about what I do online, where I go, who I tell anything to. She looked at her hands. I thought I was doing it right. I thought I was managing it. Have you reported it? Daniel said again. It was worth asking twice. The first time I filed a police report was in Richmond. 2 days later, I was contacted by a man I'd never seen, not a policeman, not anyone official, just a man in a gray coat who found me at a coffee shop I went to twice a week. She paused. He sat down across from me and said that pursuing legal complaints about Warren Price would be, quote, inadvisable. That the people who worked with Price had long memories and considerable patience. That was the full conversation. He left before my coffee was cold. Daniel processed this. So he's not just a stalker. No. She looked at him directly. He's someone who has done something genuinely criminal with a significant amount of money. I'm the only person who kept a complete enough record to prove it. As long as those records exist and I'm the one who has them, I'm a problem he hasn't solved. Where are the records? Safe deposit box. Harrisburg. The documents are physical, which was intentional. No server to hack. No cloud storage to compromise. She exhaled slowly. I've had a conversation with a federal attorney. Once. 18 months ago. He told me what I had was significant. He also told me that building a case with only one witness, who'd been attempting to stay invisible, would be complicated. He said he needed me to be willing to make a formal complaint and attach my name to it. She stopped. I wasn't ready. I was still trying to believe I could just disappear quietly, and it would stop. It didn't stop. No. She looked toward the kitchen window, the black glass that showed only darkness and rain. He showed up here 3 weeks ago. I didn't see him. I saw his car. I recognized the plates. A pause. The same week, you lent me the screwdriver. Daniel thought about that. About the 14 months she'd lived next door, while he'd been 15 feet away, fixing things, walking Emma to school, going about his ordinary life, about what it cost to sit on something like this alone. He thought about Emma, in bed 3 houses down. If I leave, he said carefully, what happens? Claire said nothing. Claire, I don't know, she said. I've been alone in this situation for 4 years. I don't know how to answer that question, because I've never had anyone to ask it to. The rain hit the kitchen window in a gust that rattled the glass. The power was still out. Somewhere outside, a car passed slowly, too slowly, and its headlights swept through the window and moved on. Daniel Carter sat down on the kitchen floor beside her and put his back against the cabinet. Okay, he said, tell me the rest. He called Emma on his cell phone. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd woken up, which meant she'd heard the wind or a sound she couldn't place, and he felt the particular small guilt of a parent who is somewhere other than where his child might need him. Hey, Bug, Daddy? Her voice was thick with interrupted sleep, the edges of it blurred and warm. Where are you? I'm at the neighbor's. Miss Claire's house. I'm going to stay for a little bit longer. Okay? Everything's fine. He kept his voice the same pitch. It always was not artificially cheerful, not pressed flat with effort, just even. Emma had a good ear for pretending. I need you to do something for me. Okay, I need you to go check that your door is locked. The front door. Then go back to bed and don't open it for anyone except me. A pause. She was 8, but she understood the weight of instructions. She'd learned that from him the difference between a request and a direction, between something that could wait and something that couldn't. She didn't ask why. She just went. Is something wrong? I'm just being careful, he said. That's my job. Okay. He heard her moving. The small sounds of her feet on the wood floor. The creak of the second step from the top that he'd been meaning to fix. Then the click of the deadbolt being checked. It's locked. Good girl. Go to bed. I'll be home before you wake up. Promise. Promise. He hung up. Claire was watching him from across the kitchen. Her expression something he couldn't fully name, careful. Maybe. Measuring. The look of someone trying to determine what kind of person they've led into their crisis. She sounds like a good kid, Claire said. She is. He looked at his phone. The signal had dropped to 1 bar, which sometimes happened in storms when the tower load spiked. The call had gone through. He didn't trust a text to follow. I'm going to check the house, he said. Every room. Then, we're going to talk about what comes next. What comes next? There are options, he said. He said it plainly, not as reassurance but as fact. I need to know what we're working with before we go through them. She started to say something, the beginning of an argument, or maybe just the instinct of someone who'd been managing this alone long enough that the presence of another person felt slightly off balance, and then stopped. Let it go. There's a basement door, she said, off the utility room. I always worry about that one. He found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer. She showed him where without being asked. Which meant she'd been thinking about darkness, about power failures, about the mechanics of the worst version of this night before tonight happened. He took note of that, of the preparation inside the fear. He moved through the house. Living room, dining room, a small office with a window that faced the side yard. The curtains here were heavier than the rest, blackout fabric, which he understood now. A bathroom off the hall. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms, another bathroom, a linen closet with a window so small it would stop a child. He checked every latch. He tested every frame. The basement door had a slide bolt that he threw. The utility room window was painted shut across its entire edge, done on purpose, he thought, or done long enough ago that it had become security by accident. Either way, it held. He came back down. She was in the living room now, standing at the edge of the curtain the way she'd been when he first arrived, the posture of someone who has been checking that window for weeks. Locks are solid, he said. Every window secured. The back door frame is older wood. If someone hit it hard with their shoulder, it would flex. Not necessarily give, but flex. I know. She said it quietly, without surprise. She'd assessed it. She'd lain awake at some point and worked through exactly that calculation. He pulled a kitchen chair to the back door and wedged it under the handle, angled against the floor, the angle that transfers force downward rather than letting the handle depress. It wouldn't stop a determined entry, but it would complicate one. It would give them time to hear it. Then he brought a chair to the front window and sat at the edge of the curtain, where he could see the street without being visible from outside. He sat. He watched. You don't have to do this, she said from across the room. I know, he said. She didn't say anything else. After a while, she sat on the couch, pulled a blanket over her legs, and watched him watch the window. They waited together in the dark, which was its own particular kind of company, not comfortable exactly, but honest. He heard the footsteps at 11:40. Not loud, not loud. That was what made them alarming, the care, the weight being distribution. 2 being distributed slowly. The kind of movement that doesn't happen by accident. Someone on the back porch who was trying very hard not to make sound. Daniel was on his feet before he'd fully registered the decision to stand. He put his hand out behind him, palm down. The gesture that means, stay, without looking back to see if Claire was watching. He moved to the kitchen in darkness, around the table edge. The chair at the back door still wedged in place. A shape at the back window. Just for a second, the outline of a head, moving across the glass, then gone. The door handle moved. He watched the chair. The angle held, the handle pressed down as far as it would go, and then stopped. Silence. Then a sharp, deliberate knock. 3 beats. Not the knock of someone who was uncertain. Daniel looked at the chair, at the deadbolt above the handle, at the old wood of the doorframe that he'd assessed 20 minutes ago. Claire. His voice was low and level. Do you have a phone that's charged? Yes. She was in the kitchen doorway. She'd followed him, staying back, but she was there. I need you to call 911. Tell them you have an intruder attempting to enter your home. Give them the address. Stay on the line. Daniel, I know what you told me about the local police, but a 911 call creates a record. Someone has to respond to it. It changes the calculus for him. She hesitated 3 seconds of real hesitation, the kind that comes from having been burned, and then he heard her dialing. The door handle moved again. Harder this time. Then the glass in the back door window cracked. Not shattered, a single crack. Controlled, someone wrapping their hand and pressing. Testing the integrity. Daniel grabbed the back of the chair with both hands. The glass held. A second push, harder. A fracture line appeared, silver in the dark. He pulled the chair free, not to open the door, but to reposition it, and drove it forward, so the top rail cracked hard against the inside of the door, just as the glass gave way and a hand came through. The sound that came from outside was not loud. A sharp exhale, the kind that comes from pain. The hand withdrew. Daniel held the chair in place and waited. Claire's voice behind him, steady and quiet. They're sending someone. 8 minutes. 8 minutes. He breathed. He counted. Nothing moved outside for 40 seconds. Then he heard footsteps again, heavier now, faster, moving away from the back porch and around the side of the house. Toward the front. Get upstairs, he said. She didn't move. He turned to look at her, and she was standing with the phone pressed against her ear, jaw set, chin up. I'm not going upstairs, she said. He didn't have time to argue it. He moved to the front of the house, killed the flashlight, let the darkness take him. The front door had a peephole. He used it. Warren Price was not what Daniel had pictured. He'd constructed something in his mind, over the last 2 hours, a certain kind of man, a certain kind of threat. What he saw through the peephole was a man in his mid-50s in a dark rain jacket, heavy-set, standing on the porch with his arms at his sides, not lunging, not raging, waiting. The composed violence of a man who'd planned this in advance and was not rattled by the setback at the back door. He raised his hand and knocked. A normal knock. Polite. Almost. Claire. His voice was clear through the door, not loud, but pitched to Carrie. I know you have company. Open the door, and I'll make this easy for everyone. Daniel kept his eye to the peephole. I know you're keeping things you shouldn't have. Price continued. I don't want to fight. I want a conversation. He paused. Tell your friend the screwdriver man to go home to his daughter. This isn't his problem. The screwdriver man, he knew. He'd been watching the street long enough to see Daniel arrive, long enough to take note of a detail. The calculation of it moved through Daniel's chest like cold water. He stepped back from the door. Claire was behind him. Her face in the dark was composed in a way that looked like it was costing her everything. He knows where Emma is, Daniel said quietly, not a question. He researches people, she said. It's what he does. He would have found out about you the day you moved in next door to me. He would have found out about Emma. Her voice didn't shake. The control she was maintaining was extraordinary and terrible to witness. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I didn't know. I didn't know he'd do this. I didn't know he'd involve. Stop. He said it quietly. Not harshly. That's not useful right now, he thought. He timed it 6 minutes before the police arrived. Approximately, if the dispatcher's estimate was accurate. 6 minutes was not nothing. 6 minutes was also not safe. He looked at the front door, at the lock, at the narrow sidelight windows flanking it, thin glass, decorative, the kind a person could break with a single blow. He looked at Claire. The documents, he said. The financial records you kept. What about them? Where are they? Physically, she studied him. Safe deposit box. Harrisburg. And there's nothing here? Nothing he could be coming for tonight? She started to say no, he saw it begin, and then something shifted in her expression. A memory surfacing. My laptop, she said slowly. Where? Upstairs office. She was already moving. There's a drive. I thought I'd wiped it. But there might be cached files, partial records. He followed her up the stairs. 3 minutes. The laptop was on the desk in the upstairs office. She went straight to it, and he stood at the window, watching the front porch below, at an angle through the rain. Price was still there, standing in the rain without an umbrella, unhurried, waiting. How long does it take to wipe a drive? Daniel said. I can pull the physical drive. It takes 30 seconds. She was already on her knees, flipping the laptop over. Below, Price stepped off the porch. He moved to the side of the house. He's circling, Daniel said. Her hands moved faster. A small tool from the desk drawer, a precision screwdriver. Different from the one he'd brought back, and the back panel coming loose. A sound from downstairs. Not the door. Something else. The creak of the side gate. Claire. Almost. The drive came free. She held it in her palm, and then crossed to the window and looked out at the rain. Below them was the side yard, the gate. The narrow strip of dark between the houses. Price was not visible. Police should be here, Daniel said. As if answering him, a blue and red wash of light appeared at the far end of the street, moving slow, and then the sound of the side gate. Daniel turned. He put himself between the hallway and Claire. He could hear footsteps in the yard below closer now, the wet crunch of someone on gravel, and then the beam of a flashlight cutting across the side window. A voice from outside. Official? Clipped. Police department. Anyone home? We need you to come to the front door. A different light, then moving fast, going away. Footsteps on the gravel again. Faster now. Heading toward the back of the property. Daniel moved. Down the stairs, to the front door. He threw the deadbolt and opened it, and a uniformed officer was on the porch, hand raised, rain behind her. Sir. You the one who called? She did. He went around the back, dark jacket. Heavy set. 50s. The officer was already on her radio, turning, moving off the porch. 2 more cars, now, pulling up. Voices in the yard. He went back inside. Claire was at the top of the stairs. One hand on the railing, the drive still in her palm. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. He's gone, Daniel said. They're looking. She sat down on the top step. Not slowly, just all at once, like a string had been cut. They found Warren Price 2 blocks away. He'd made it to a parked car, registered to a rental agency under a name that took the county detective 40 minutes to begin unraveling. He'd been calm when they stopped him. Which was not the calm of innocence, but the calculated stillness of someone running probability. His hands had been in his jacket pockets. He'd asked for his attorney before the officer had finished the sentence, but the broken glass at Claire's back door was evidence. The cracked panel, the glass distributed across the porch in the pattern that made clear which side the pressure had come from, and Daniel had given a statement calm and chronological, beginning with the screwdriver and ending with Price's voice through the front door, with a voice recorder running and Detective Holloway's pen moving steadily in her notebook. The detail about Emma seemed to interest Holloway particularly. She'd asked him to repeat it. The screwdriver man, go home to your daughter. She'd written it down twice, on separate lines. By 2 in the morning, Holloway was sitting in Claire's kitchen. The power had come back on at midnight, a transformer issue in the next block, unrelated to any of this, which was somehow the most startling fact of the evening. Claire had made coffee. The ordinary act of measuring grounds and running the tap and waiting for the machine seemed to ground her in something. Give her hands a purpose. Holloway asked her questions. Good ones, specific ones. The kind that came from someone who understood that the gap between "I was followed" and "I have reason to believe this constitutes federal financial fraud" was a gap worth bridging carefully. Claire answered them, all of them, this time not the edited version, not the careful minimum. The whole of it, which was long, and had parts she hadn't spoken aloud before. Daniel sat at the kitchen table and listened and said nothing, because it wasn't his story to add to. He refilled the coffee when the pot ran low. When Holloway finally closed her notebook, she looked at Claire with the expression of someone who had heard many difficult things and had developed a way of holding them without letting the weight show in her posture. "You should have called us sooner," she said. Then, before Claire could respond, "I know why you didn't. I'm not criticizing, I'm telling you so that you know it's different now. There's a record. There's a complaint that names names. There are witnesses." A pause. "It's different now," Claire nodded. She looked like someone who had been underwater for a very long time and was only now remembering what air felt like. Daniel slipped out the front door while Holloway was finishing her paperwork. He walked the 15 feet home in a rain that had softened to almost nothing, a fine mist that was more atmosphere than weather. He let himself in. The alarm beeped, and he entered the code. Emma's door was open an inch. He pushed it wider and stood in the doorway. She was asleep on her side, blanket pulled up to her chin, one hand tucked under her cheek. Her gray-green eyes were closed. Her breathing was the slow, even breathing of someone in a place completely without danger. He stood there for a while and let himself look at her, which was something he did sometimes not to check on her, not out of anxiety, but because it steadied him, because there was something about her sleeping face, ordinary and unguarded, that made the world feel correctly sized. He went to the kitchen and made coffee in the dented percolator and sat at his own table in the dark, listening to the mist. At 3:45, headlights crossed the front window Holloway's car, leaving. At 4, the last patrol unit pulled away. He was still at the table when Emma came downstairs at 6:15, hair sleep-tangled, wearing the pajamas with the small stars on them. She stopped when she saw him. "You stayed up," she said. "Yeah." She came to the table and climbed into the chair beside him and leaned against his arm, the way she'd done since she was small enough to fit entirely in his lap. He put his arm around her. "You always come back," she said. Not dramatically, just as a fact. The kind of fact you state to remind yourself it's true. He rested his chin on top of her head. "Yeah, bug," he said. "That's the deal." The rain had stopped. Through the kitchen window, the sky was beginning to turn the pale gray that happens before any real color comes the light before the light. The moment before the day commits to anything. He could hear Emma breathing. He held on. 3 weeks later, he was repainting the porch. He'd finally gotten to it. The weather had cleared and held, and he'd bought the paint a deep charcoal gray, which Emma had approved after careful deliberation and taken 2 days to do the job properly, sanding and priming, and not rushing the coat. He heard the front gate and looked up. Claire came up the walk carrying 2 cups of coffee. She looked like herself. The version of herself he'd glimpsed before all of this. The one who crossed the yard unhurried and accepted things at face value. She looked like someone who had slept. "Detective Holloway called me this morning," she said. "They've referred the financial records to the federal prosecutor's office." A pause. "It's going to take a long time." "These things do," he said. She handed him one of the cups. He took it. She looked at the porch, the half-painted section, the careful edgework he'd done around the trim. Nice color. Emma picked it. Emma has good taste. He drank the coffee. It was good, better than his. She'd remembered he didn't take sugar. He wasn't sure when she'd learned that. They stood on the porch in the October morning, the neighborhood going about its ordinary business around them, a car backing out 2 houses down, a kid on a bike at the far end of the block, leaves collecting in the gutters from the oaks that line the street, the whole of Birchwood Lane looking exactly like itself. "I've been thinking about leaving again," Claire said, "relocating." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about it," she said again, slower. "And I'm not going to. I have a good house. I like this neighborhood. She looked down at her cup. I like my neighbors. He turned back to the porch rail and set down his brush. You should know, he said, that the priming on your side door is completely shot. The paint's peeling all the way down to bare wood. If you don't address it before winter, you're looking at rot. She blinked, then very quietly she laughed. Is that an offer? It's an observation. Right. She was still almost smiling. Well, I'll think about it. She finished her coffee. She handed him the empty cup and walked back down the path and through the gate and into her own yard, and he watched her go with the particular attention of a man who doesn't quite realize he's watching until she's already through the door. He picked up his brush. He went back to the rail. You picked the perfect night. He'd been thinking about that, what she'd meant by it. He understood it better now. She'd meant that she'd been alone in her house with something she couldn't face alone. And he'd knocked on the door, and the timing of it had been improbable enough to feel like something more than coincidence. Maybe it was. He was not a man given to believing in the machinery of fate. He believed in work, in maintenance, in showing up. He believed that small actions have weight, that returning a tool when you said you would, walking 15 feet in the rain, could open doors that would otherwise stay shut. He believed in Emma, asleep upstairs when the world was too much, waking to say you always come back as if it were the simplest fact in the world. He painted the porch. The morning held. Somewhere behind him, through the open front door, he heard Emma come downstairs and start talking to herself the way she did when she thought no one was listening. A quiet narrative of her own interior life, full of plans and opinions. He smiled, though she couldn't see it. The sun came over the oaks and fell warm on the charcoal gray boards, and Daniel Carter painted, unhurried, in the ordinary light of a morning that had nothing left to hide. Detective Holloway's investigation widened through November and into December. The financial records in the Harrisburg safe deposit box, which Claire retrieved in the company of a federal agent and a county deputy, on a Tuesday morning, when the sky was the flat gray of late autumn, turned out to be more comprehensive than even Claire had known, because she'd been careful at a time when she hadn't fully realized how careful she was being. There were 7 years of reconciliation discrepancies. There were side accounts. There were 2 offshore transfers that the federal prosecutor described, in a phone call Claire relayed to Daniel afterward, as the kind of thing that accelerates timelines. By January, Warren Price had been charged on 4 federal counts. His attorney was expensive and confident, and that confidence appeared, over the following weeks, to be performing a quiet erosion. Claire testified in the preliminary hearing in February, driving to the courthouse 2 counties over with Detective Holloway in a car that smelled like burned coffee and industrial upholstery cleaner. She came back the same evening, not speaking in the car, and then not speaking on Birchwood Lane, and then knocking on Daniel's door. Emma answered it. She'd been allowed to stay up because it was Friday, and because she'd finished her reading for the week early, and had been quite deliberate about pointing this out. She opened the door and looked at Claire with the unmediated directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be careful about what she observed. "Miss Claire, you look tired," she said. "I am," Claire said. It was a long day. Emma considered this with the gravity she brought to most facts. "We have soup," she said. She said it in the tone of someone offering a solution to a complicated problem, which was, Daniel thought, more or less what she was doing. He'd come to the door in time to see this exchange. He looked at Claire. She looked at him. There was no conversation in the look. They'd moved past the stage where every glance needed to be decoded, but there was an ease in it that was its own kind of language. He stepped back from the door. "We have soup," he confirmed. She came in. The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table under the warm overhead light, and Emma covered a remarkable amount of ground what she was currently reading, which was a book about deep-sea creatures that she recommended to Claire with sincere urgency, her current theory about which direction the creek behind the school ran in winter versus summer. A detailed account of a disagreement she'd had with her best friend Josephine that had been resolved. She reported, through negotiation. Claire listened the way adults listen when they're genuinely interested rather than merely polite. asking follow-up questions that Emma answered with increasing enthusiasm. Daniel made the soup. He listened to both of them from across the kitchen, his back to the room, stirring. He found himself smiling at the counter, without meaning to. Later, when Emma was in bed, Claire sat at the table with a second cup of tea, and Daniel sat across from her. The soup bowls had been cleared. The kitchen was quiet, in the way kitchens get quiet when the business of the meal is over, and whatever comes next hasn't been decided. Outside, the January night was cold and still. He waited. He was good at waiting. "The prosecutor told me today that I'm credible," Claire said. Those were his exact words. "You are a credible witness." He seemed to mean it as a compliment. She turned the teacup in her hands. "I've spent 4 years trying to be invisible, and now the most useful thing about me is that I'm credible." "That's not the most useful thing about you," Daniel said. She looked up. "The most useful thing about you is that you kept records when you were scared, and it would have been easier not to." He kept his voice even. "The credibility is just what happened because of that." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said finally. "For the night you stayed. And for everything after. You don't have to keep thanking me." "I know." She looked at her cup. "I'm not thanking you because I have to. I'm thanking you because I don't have the right words for the larger thing, so I keep using the small ones and hoping they add up." He thought about that for a moment. He thought about the screwdriver, the 15-foot walk in the rain, the decision that hadn't felt like a decision at all, just the next sensible thing to do, return to its owner, door opened, step inside. All those ordinary inches that somehow added to something else. "They do," he said. She finished her tea. He walked her to the door, and she put on her coat in the narrow entryway, and she paused on the threshold in the way she sometimes did, not long, just a moment, a half-second of standing still between his house and the cold outside, as if the distance between those two things required a breath before crossing. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Claire." She walked down the porch steps and along the path to the gate. He watched until she was through her own front door, the porch light catching the back of her coat for 1 second before the door closed. He watched after that, too, for a moment. The habit had formed somewhere in the last 3 months, and he hadn't bothered to examine it. He closed the door. He checked the lock. He went upstairs and stood for a moment in the dark hallway outside Emma's room, listening. Slow, even breathing. Completely at rest. He went to bed. The winter stars were out, sharp and particular through the bedroom window, the way they get when the air is cold and clean, and there is nothing left in it to blur or soften what's there. He lay in the dark and thought about small things, the screwdriver back in its slot in the kit, the porch boards drying in the gray charcoal shade Emma had chosen, the soup on the stove going cold now in the quiet kitchen. Which was fine. There was enough left for tomorrow. He thought about Emma's voice on the phone in the dark house. "You always come back." A fact she'd decided he needed to hear, stated plainly. "No decoration." He thought, yes. That's the deal. He fell asleep before he finished the thought. And outside on Birchwood Lane, the neighborhood held its ordinary lights in the cold. Each house a small warmth, and the street was quiet, and nothing moved.